toujours comme ça avant une présentation, c'est le truc que je suis. Le bois Wenge là, de République démocratique du Congo, qui a été saisi en Allemagne, on est bien d'accord que c'était Greenpeace qui avait donné l'info.
Je pense. Je suis pas tellement sûr.
Right. Well, I'm here on time, setting a good example. The attractions of tea and biscuits are such that our audience is a bit slow to return.
Well, it's also it's always very important to socialise these events.
Yes. I mean, we have a wonderful conference, so very interesting speakers, but there's only a certain amount you can cram into the day, I think, and how to put it, we're at the limits of capacity. Anyway, this will be good, I'm sure. Your law and policy advisor, climate and forests, and to do with projects in Ghana, Burundi, and your background in law and form. Gosh, I'm just intimidated by these people who have linguistic abilities. I struggle with English on a bad day, but English, French, German, Spanish, Dutch is just unbelievable. So you go around these different countries and you can use those languages.
Yeah, some of the languages are going to become a bit rusty, especially French and Spanish are difficult to combine. So if I talk Spanish for a year or two, my French level goes down, and the other way around.
I did a project for FAO, Food and Agricultural Organisation, the United Nations, and it was to do with shrimp farming and the environmental impacts of this, and the way that you would regulate shrimp farming. And it involved comparing legislation in, I think there were about 20 developing countries, and some of these were Asian countries, some were African countries and South American countries. There were three of us, and the lady was French speaking, so she did really well with all the African jurisdictions, because a lot of them were French speaking. The guy, he was actually from Brazil, but he was Spanish speaking, and again he could all the South American countries. So between the three of us, it was remarkable that we managed linguistically. French and Spanish, it strikes me, are extremely good languages to have, so we did manage to get some sense out of it. But I still found that, when I went to do this many years back, probably one of my first international talks, I went to a conference in Bangladesh, in Thailand, and again it was about aquaculture and the impacts on the environment, and there must have been 20 speakers from different Asian countries. Every one of them stood up and gave a presentation in good English, and I thought, God, this is tremendous advantage.
Amazing.
You can go around the world and you can speak English and everyone will understand you. The problem is it makes you very lazy when it comes to these other languages. But speaking them, how many is that, 5 languages?
Yeah.
I'm just in awe of people who have linguistic abilities.
So I come from the northern part of Belgium, which is Flemish. So it's the same group of languages as English and German. So from Flemish to German is like from Spanish to Portuguese. It's not that big of a jump.
Yeah.
So that's pretty okay. We also all have subtitles. which means your English is a lot more at speed than if everything were dubbed. French is because we have that as an official language in our country, so you're obliged to
in Belgium, or
so we have 3 official languages. We have French.
you have several different languages. There's Flemish is spoken in some parts, and French,
and German.
and German.
Those are the 3 official languages.
So you wake up from the cradle speaking 3 different languages, depending what day it is.
The German is not that strongly represented in education. But I have a German mother, so I was lucky, kind of got that with me from the beginning. And then the Spanish, I learned thanks to Erasmus, which is an EU program of exchange.
I know about Erasmus. So you were sent somewhere which was Spanish speaking.
I studied a year in Spain.
Great. You came back fluent. So these English people are really lazy, aren't they?
I learned French when we were about 5 to 17, and it was useless.
But I had the same experience with the amount of time I spent learning French. It just didn't stick. And there's something maybe about the English psychology in language learning. The rest of them will learn English, so we probably don't need to try. Very bad. I mean, I can't defend it, but it's usually a fact of life. Anyway, I'm looking forward to insights from you 3 hosts on different aspects of forestry. And Jozef's starting the ball rolling. Yes, the first talk, and you've coordinated what you're going to say, have you? Is that right? You're both from Clotilde.
Yeah, so we coordinate definitely. We are 2 kind of sides of the same medal.
Yeah, and mine might just be a bit of a...
Well, I really like the first panel. We have somebody from Allied Business to disturb things. I suspect some kind of consensus is going to break out between you folks. So if you can disagree with each other, it'll don't want me to start. I'm conscious we've lost a bit of time. Ladies and gentlemen, clearly this is a great networking event where you meet lots of people you haven't seen for a while and make important links, but it means we need some wild horses to drag people back to the conference sessions. That's not such a bad thing, but it's just I have this feeling we're going to finish off on a high note, or 2 high notes, with sessions respectively about forest protection and waste management, 2 areas that are of a special interest to me. And they're panel sessions, so we're going to hear, I hope, some slightly different views from different speakers, but there do happen to be 2 people from the Client Earth speaking first, and they've agreed that they're going to disagree with one another, but I don't know by how much. Let me shut up and move on. Jozef is speaking first. Jozef Weyns, Client Earth law and policy advisor on climate and forests. He's a vast international experience and just awesome linguistic abilities, but judged by my low baseline, maybe that's not so surprising. Jozef, please will you take the floor and say thank you.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. Much of today has been about TTIP. Many of you seem to be worried that this agreement would lower social and environmental standards. Many of you seem also to be worried on how TTIP has been negotiated so far. So before we all walk out of here thinking trade agreements are bad news, I wanted to take the next 15 minutes to talk to you about a different type of trade agreement. Maybe a bit of more positive story. So, the trade agreement I would like to talk about is one that specifically aims to ensure legality based on higher standards rather than lower. Yes, they exist, and they are called voluntary partnership agreements. Now, just out of curiosity, those who have already heard about these voluntary partnership agreements, could I see your hand? A couple. I think I may be a bit more geeky than I thought I would be. But basically, these VPAs are trade agreements between timber-producing countries and the European Union. They aim to ensure that all timber that is imported from these countries is legal. Now, legal can mean many things. I am sure that if you, and not much of you, if you ask a lawyer, is that legal, you will not get a straight answer. So let me clarify what I mean, or what VPAs mean if they speak about legal. First, legal is legal according to the laws of the country of harvest. Please, in your minds, put a little asterisk by this first aspect, because I'm going to come back to it in a couple of minutes. Secondly, legal means more than just a piece of paper that looks official and that has an official stamp on it. VPAs put in place a certification scheme that should be able to track timber from the forest until the harbour in the EU where it is offloaded. And it should be able to ensure that along all this way, all criteria of legality are complied with. Now, all nice and well, but how does that give us higher standards? Remember the asterisks we just put by the first criteria of legality, the first aspect of legality, where we said it is legal according to the laws of the country of harvest. There is a little extra step. It is legal according to a legality definition that is based on the laws of the country of harvest. And this is where VPAs are different. This definition and the VPAs have been negotiated between the EU and key stakeholders from those countries. So rather than the classic model of the European Commission negotiating with the government, the voluntary partnerships agreements have been negotiated with industry, government agencies, but also civil society representatives around the negotiation table. And this has led to a definition where the legality is defined using the higher standards in the national law of the country of harvest, and where the more dubious laws have been excluded. The VPAs actually go one step further. Apart from defining what legality means according to those national laws, they also include a list of aspirations for legal reform. Basically, a list of where higher standards are still lacking and are still needed. All in all, it seems a very, very beautiful story, I would say. But did it work? Now, I have to say, I mainly work with partners in Ghana. It's the first country to sign such a VPA with the European Union. So most of my experience comes from working in this context. So on the first account of using higher standards and improving decision-making processes, I would say yes, it worked. Let me give you the example of a specific type of logging permits. In Ghana, they have what they call the special permits. These are logging permits that have been granted based on a loophole clause included somewhere in an amending law that has been passed through Parliament rapidly. So a type of permit, type of logging permit that seems a bit dubious. It has not been included in the legality definition, and therefore the last 4 years such permits have not been granted anymore. Back to whether it worked or not. On the second account, whether certificates to guarantee legality have been issued. And there I would say almost. of all the VPA countries, none of them has yet issued these legality licenses. But if all goes well, by the end of this year, Ghana should start issuing them. That is if all goes well. So what am I doing here? Talking about trade agreements between the European Union and Ghana. Actually, together with national lawyers, we work to provide legal support to local NGOs. When other stakeholders like NGOs are sitting at a table of negotiations, often it's very technical and very legal discussions. So we provide some of that legal support. And this morning already, I think in the session by Mr. Fowles, he mentioned that so often the legal argument is a conversation killer. So that's what we do. We provide capacity so that the legal argument can be a start rather than an end of a conversation. I think I may be running out of time, so let me conclude. Clearly, trade agreements can mean many things. So after having listened to the doubts expressed by many of you on how and what of TTIP, I wanted to point out that the setup and the way these voluntary partnership agreements are negotiated can actually lead to higher rather than to lower environmental standards. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. You've set out issues. I'm sure these will be pursued by your colleagues. May I welcome your colleague from Clotilde Henriot? I hope I pronounced that right, who's part of the African Forests team. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, first of all, by my name, you might have understood that I'm not English, so do not hesitate if you don't understand me to raise your hand. It might happen. So, to start with, you should know that international illegal trade timber is estimated to be worth billions of euros per year in Europe. First of all, what is illegal logging? Illegal logging is the harvesting of timber in contravention of the laws and regulation of the country of harvest. The trade in illegal logging has significant negative impacts. Economic negative impacts with loss of revenues coming, for example, from non-payment of taxes. It has some environmental impacts, which will probably interest you. Of course, the first that we can think of is deforestation, but also, of course, climate change and loss of biodiversity. In terms of negative social impact, we are talking about depossession of local communities and indigenous people rights, as well as conflict over land and conflict over resources. And going back to local communities, we can also say that, of course, they do not benefit from timber production when the timber comes from illegal harvesting. So in 2003, the European has decided to take a flexi action plan to fight against illegal logging and to respond to illegal logging. And this flexi action plan has led to two pieces of legislation. On one hand, you have VPAs, which have been presented by Jozef, and on the other hand, you have EUTR. The EUTR, which was proposed by the Commission in 2008 and adopted by the EU Parliament and the Council in October 2010. The importance of explaining on one hand what is a VPA and on the other hand what is EUTR is important because, of course, we have seen with VPA that we have an opportunity with a voluntary partnership agreement to have some legal timber, to make sure that some legal timber will have access to the EU market. But unfortunately, first of all, not because it's a voluntary partnership agreement, it means that producer countries are not obliged to sign that kind of agreement. So today we have 6 countries who have signed a voluntary partnership agreement, mostly in West and Central Africa. And of course, some are still in negotiation, and we hope that other negotiation will come up in terms of voluntary partnership agreement. And most importantly, even if the first one has been signed in 2009 by Ghana, in 2015 we are still expecting the FLECT license. The FLECT license is basically the permit which will demonstrate the license which will demonstrate that the timber is legal and can access the EU. And because it's a very complex system, this system is taking a lot of time to become operational, and it's not yet operational for example, for the 2 countries who can have some FLECT license, we hope very soon, Indonesia and Ghana. So therefore, it was hugely important for the EU to have another regulation. The other reason, of course, is that the EU is a very, very big. It's the trade of timber represents a very important market in terms of import. So, and very, very frequently, the timber is coming from country or region known for being high-risk country in terms of illegal logging. That's why it was that important to have a regulation to prohibit illegal harvesting timber being placed in the EU market. So now let's go to the heart of the UTR. What is the UTR? The UTR has been introduced to stop illegally logged timber accessing the market of the 28 member states. This regulation was adopted, like I said before, in 2010, but fully applies since March 2013. It's the responsibility of the 28 member states to enforce this regulation. Now I will explain the main requirements of the EUTR and what does it mean for the people who placed illegal, not illegal, simply timber in the EU market. Let's admit that even if we have illegal market, some people are doing their job right, and some legal timber is also accessing the EU market. So the main requirements of this regulation. There is 2 actors who have to comply with some obligation. You have the operators, who are going to be the one who have the most important responsibility. We name operators the people who are placing timber in the EU market for the first time. Then we have traders. Traders are the people who sell or buy timber who have already been placed in the EU market. So the operators have two main obligations. The first one, of course, they are prohibited to place illegal timber in the EU market. And the second one, which I will explain a little bit more in depth, is their obligation to adopt and exercise a due diligence system. A due diligence system, it's a mechanism quite interesting, and you will see that it presents some challenges for operators to make it operational. So the idea of the due diligence system is for an operator to be able to assess that the timber he's going to place in the market has been legally harvested. For that, there is 3 steps within the due diligence system. The first step, you have to collect information. Which will help to understand if the timber has been legally harvested. We are talking about information related to the name of the species, related to the country of origin, related to the supplier, and related also to all information which will demonstrate that the timber has been logged in fully compliance with the law of origin. So where and that's a very important aspect. The legality under EUTR is the legality of what we call the applicable legislation. It's the legality coming from the country of harvest. So that's the country of harvest who determines the criteria of legality within only legislation and with the international treaties that he might have ratified. So then, first, after the first step of collecting all those information, you have to assess the risk that and evaluate the risk that the timber you are going to place in the market is legal. For that, you need looking at the information that you just collected to see if it seems that the timber is legal, and you also have other set of criteria to assess that, which can be, for example, to make sure that there is no sanction from the United Nations against one country on because of illegal timber, that there is no high prevalence of illegally harvested timber in some regions, and you can also look, for example, at the complexity of the supply chain. And at the end of these assessments, if it appears that there is no negligible risk that the timber has been harvested illegally, you need to mitigate the risk. And for that, you need to collect other information. So you need to look for other information to make sure that the timber has been harvested legally. For that, you can use third parties' information to make sure of that, or any other type of information. So that's the two main requirements for operators, the prohibition requirements and the due diligence obligation. Now that, and for the traders, sorry, it's an obligation of traceability. It means that they have to collect information about their suppliers, so to whom they are going to sell the timber and from whom they buy the timber for at least 5 years. Now, in terms of implementation and enforcement of the EUTR since 2014, it's important to say first that every member state has to adopt a penalty regime to make sure that if there is an infringement of the EUTR, the operator will be sanctioned for it. So every member state has to adopt a penalty regime, and it has taken some time for some countries, and in some countries it's not yet the case. We don't have a penalty regime. You can obviously see the problem. Without a penalty regime, it's difficult to conduct checks on operators and difficult to sanction them. So that has been one part of the main challenge to implement and enforce the EUTR. Secondly, how do we verify that operators have been compliant with the EUTR? For that, it's in each member state there is what we call the competent authority, who has the responsibility to enforce the EUTR and who has the responsibility to carry out checks on operators to make sure that, for example, they exercise properly a due diligence system. For those checks, some countries have been quite proactive, and some countries have been really not proactive. It's easy, I'm going to talk about France, for example, so like that I'm not bashing on other one country. France is not good at implementing the EUTR, let's face it. it took them, let's say, I'm not going to be French for this, it took them almost 2 years to adopt a law to have a penalty regime, and now they're fighting against different ministries to make sure of who is responsible to carry the check. So it's taking time. In other countries, like the UK, for example, it's better implemented. Something very important that, and about the penalties which have already been applied, what we can say, for example, is that member states seems at the beginning, obviously, more inclined to send, for example, notice of remedy. So just warn people that they have to comply more properly, exercise a better due diligence system, rather than, for example, because the penalties can be fines, seizure of timber, and the fines can be huge. But at this stage, we are still waiting for, or maybe all operators are doing good, but we are still waiting for big penalties, which will probably calm down other people who are trading illegal timber inside the EU. The main, I'm going to be quick now. The thing important about UTR that I wanted to highlight is the role of civil society within the UTR. You should know that there is a specific provision in the UTR which allows third party to give information to competent authority, information about illegal timber. And it's quite important because based on this information, the competent authority could decide to carry out checks, and the competent authority could also include those information to plan their check based on the risk of illegality. So that's a big role for civil society. Exactly the same. It's in some countries it has been hard for civil society to be heard, and in some countries it has been better. We know that recently, for example, Greenpeace in Belgium has managed to not to force, but to encourage the Belgian competent authority to conduct checks on timber coming from Brazil. So this timber has been seized. Unfortunately, the evidence according to the Belgian competent authority were not strong enough, so the timber has been released, but at least it's a beginning. It demonstrates that civil society can have power on that. I'm going to conclude now by saying that what seems relevant about the UTR is the fact that it's a regulation who fights illegal logging, which could help, of course, fighting deforestation. The thing is, you should know that illegal logging is, and mainly over the last 10 years, timber is not the only one commodity who harms the forest. You have other commodities like palm oil, soya, who harm with the land use forest, with the forest, I'm confused, with the conversion of forest land. Of course, it leads to deforestation, and for that we can imagine to have similar regulation as EUTR, but politically it seems that people are not very inclined to have the same kind of regulation, but at least we can base the experience that we have on EUTR to imagine other mechanisms to regulate the legality of other commodities. And of course we have other tools which can be used, like the zero deforestation commitment taken by some companies. Recently, lots of companies have decided to take those commitments. We now need to see how it will work and how we can check that this deforestation commitment is really happening. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Clotilde, for those interesting observations and to mention the problem. The final speaker in this session is Leonie Lawrence, who works in the Drivers of Deforestation programme, the Oxford-based think tank Global Canopy programme. She's looking at the scientific, political and financial case for safeguarding tropical forests, and has an extensive background. Amongst her distinctions is that she's a graduate of the University of Kent, so it's good to see that they go on and do great things in changing the world. Would you like to come to your presentation, Leonie? Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, and thank you, Clotilde, for setting the scene so beautifully about what I'm going to be talking about now, which is more related to the other commodities linked to deforestation that have just been mentioned. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about a project we recently launched in February called the Forest 500. I will kind of set the scene a little bit to that project and then give you an overview of our methodology and our findings, and then talk about what we aim to do with the project next. So some probably very familiar background for you. Tropical forests are obviously vitally important, not least for their for providing habitat for about half of the world's terrestrial biodiversity, but also for providing vital ecosystem services. We have seen obviously a huge amount of deforestation, and as Clotilde mentioned, a huge amount of this is driven by agro conversion for commercial agriculture, so for increasing demand for different products, for food, feed, fibre and fuel products, and this demand is only set to continue. About 80% of new agricultural land in the past decade or so has come from intact and undisturbed tropical forests, and some estimates put the figure of what commercial agriculture contributes to deforestation is even higher than this 50% here. So a study last September put it closer to 75%, and even went as far as saying that about half of that is actually illegal, and about a quarter of that illegal conversion is for an export market, so for international demand for these products. Core to this commercial agriculture and core to driving to deforestation are the commodities listed here. There is some good news in that a lot of the supply chain actors involved in these commodities are beginning to take steps to addressing deforestation and in ensuring that their operations aren't linked to forest destruction. So we've seen significant commitments by some of the biggest corporations involved in these supply chains. So just in the last few weeks, we've seen ADM announce a no deforestation policy for soya and palm oil. We have other actors such as Wilmar, which is responsible for about 45% of the global palm oil trade, has a similar policy for palm oil, no deforestation, no peatland conversion and no exploitation policy. And we're also increasingly seeing a number of collective commitments to addressing global forest loss. So the New York Declaration on Forests notably, for the first time, brought together multiple different stakeholders, from companies to the financial community and governments and civil society, in establishing a global timeline to address deforestation. And part of that timeline includes removing deforestation from supply chains by 2020. But the big question is, obviously, how are these ambitious commitments being translated into the sectors and into the markets where action is most needed? And how can we begin to monitor that progress? And that is where the Forest 500 comes in. So it aims to identify, rank and track progress among the policies of the 500 power brokers most linked to deforestation through their involvement in the supply chains I've just mentioned. So be they governments, companies, investors, and a variety of other stakeholders who also have a part to play. So things like certification schemes and international policy initiatives as well. By assessing the public policies and information that these actors present, we aim to increase accountability and transparency among their commitments, but also to identify the key areas and the key actors who are yet to make similar commitments, and where progress is needed urgently if we're to meet these ambitious goals. So how did we select these power brokers to include in the Forest 500? We used a variety of information sources, starting with data on deforestation rates and forest cover and commodity production to identify the key tropical forest countries that represent kind of the heart of this problem. So the 25 forest countries that we identified represent the vast amount of tropical forest cover, almost 90%, and similar levels of deforestation as well in the last 10 years. They also represent a significant proportion of commodity production across the tropics. So over 95% of palm oil, mostly from Malaysia and Indonesia, and about 99% of all soya produced in the tropics as well, just from a few Latin American countries. We then tracked chain of custody of these commodities to identify the key processing and consuming countries, and identified 15 trading jurisdictions, which together represent over 70% of the import value of these commodities from those tropical forest countries that we'd previously identified. We could then conduct more in-depth supply chain research to identify the specific companies who are involved in these supply chains in the markets and in the countries most likely to be sourcing these commodities from forest regions. As very few companies actually report on the specific volumes of these commodities they use, we have to use a sort of risk, a level of risk, rather than saying that these are specifically linked to deforestation. We can say that as they are in the industries that use most of these commodities, they should have the policies in place to ensure that they're not sourcing commodities linked to deforestation. Of the companies we identified, about 150 of the 250 are public companies. So we could then identify who the major shareholders in these companies are, and therefore who similarly should have policies in place to protect against the risk that they're driving deforestation. We then assessed them. So we looked at the information they present on their policies. So for companies, for example, we looked at their overall deforestation policies, what their policies are for either producing or sourcing each of the commodities of relevance to their operations, how these policies are translated across their businesses. So does it apply to all of their subsidiaries or just to certain regions, and does it apply to their suppliers also? And then finally, we looked at how they're reporting progress and how they're making this information public to see if they're actually fulfilling these commitments. So we then have displayed all of this information on the Forest 500 platform. So we talk a little bit about each power broker, how they're linked to these supply chains, and then how they score in our assessments, and a breakdown across each of the policy areas that I mentioned. So what have we found out? When looking at forest jurisdictions, despite the fact that many forest countries have signed up to things such as the New York Declaration on Forests, which aims for zero deforestation, at the moment this is not necessarily being translated into national policies, which isn't particularly surprising given that there's a lot of ambiguity over what zero deforestation really means and how that can fit with agricultural development targets. But we are seeing some commitments, particularly in relation to specific regions in certain countries, or industry-led initiatives in relation to specific commodities, such as the soy moratorium in Brazil. With regards to trading jurisdictions, we also see a huge amount of variation. And at the moment, it's really only the European countries and the US that are really taking steps to understand the impacts of their consumption and their imports on tropical forests. The EU countries, for example, collectively looking at the results of our policy assessments, score quite well, taking into account initiatives such as the EUTR and the VPAs that have been talked about earlier. And this is notable given that these countries are responsible for about 20% of the imports value of all these commodities from the tropical forest countries. What's more concerning is the fact that many of the countries responsible for a huge amount of the trade are still not taking steps to kind of understand the impacts of their imports and haven't really got the policies in place. When we look at the results of our company assessments, again, we see quite high variation. So there are some real clear market leaders who have quite ambitious policies in place. Many of these are some quite well-known brands, and these commitments have been pretty well publicised over the last few years. Across all of the 250 companies, only about 7% have net zero or zero deforestation commitments in place across all commodities. Many more have commodity-specific policies, but when we look at which commodities they have policies for, we're seeing that there are many more for palm oil and timber and fewer in place for soya and cattle products. And this is likely due to the fact that it's these commodities that have been the subject of more scrutiny in recent years. We're also seeing a lot of regional variation in where companies are based and how well developed their policies are. So companies based in North America and Europe are tending to score higher. We also see some variation in policy scores related to company governance structure and revenue. So publicly traded companies tend to score higher. Again, perhaps not that surprising given that the requirements for public reporting and the increased transparency of these companies. And we're also seeing, you can see in the bottom graph there, that companies that report revenues of over $10 billion tend to score about twice as high as those reporting revenues of less than $1 billion. We also see significant variation in the sort of stage of policy development across sectors. So companies in the home and personal care industry are scoring higher than those, for example, in the animal feed industry. The animal feed industry is clearly then a key industry for us to engage with going forward. It is responsible for a huge amount of soy consumption in the EU. And what's particularly striking about these results is that many of the companies that we've identified in the animal feed industry are based in Europe, where companies on the whole are scoring higher. So that's a key question for us, is why they are then don't have as well developed policies. The findings of our investor assessments show that a significant proportion of investment in our publicly traded Forest 500 companies originates in North America. About 80% of the investment is from firms based in North America, and 77% is within the US. This is quite concerning, given that when we looked at the policies of these firms, we see that it's North American financial institutions that are actually scoring particularly low. So that's an area we're increasingly looking to engage with. Overall, the financial community is sort of a few steps behind the companies that they're investing in, and at the moment their policies don't seem to reflect the most well-developed policies of the corporates that we've identified. So that's, as I said, that's somewhere where we're increasingly looking to focus our attention. So our next steps for the project, this assessment is something we want to do every year until 2020, until many of these targets are set for, to see whether these targets are being met by similar progress when we look at the policies. We're working with a number of different partners to refine the methodology, incorporating feedback from the companies that we've been working with to ensure that the ways in which we're assessing their policies reflects the reality of the situation on the ground. And we're also looking at ways where we can begin to look at policy implementation and assessing that. Obviously, policies are a very necessary step, but they're just the first step. And without implementation of these policies, then we're not going to see the progress that we want to see. We're also working with a number of other NGOs who have come up with similar policy tracking tools to make sure that the ways in which we're assessing companies and what we're calling for can be more aligned. This is definitely easier said than done, given that NGOs are working to different missions and different funders and things. So that's obviously a challenge, but something that we're looking forward to engaging on. So I guess the key message, and to conclude, is that there is a lot of ambition and there has been a lot of progress, but it needs to be followed up with implementation, and it needs to be followed up with similar commitments and policy progress across sectors and not just by a few market leaders. Thank you very much.
Thanks tremendously, Leonie, for that presentation. I'm just very conscious I'm sharing the stage with three superbly well-informed people who've given great insights into the complexities of the issue of securing greater sustainability in forest management. So I'm very grateful for all three presentations. They seem to fit together pretty well to me, given the time constraint we have. Maybe just time for a question or two if there are particular points from that people wanted to raise. This gentleman here. You have spoken before, but if you can remind us your name.
Yes, Jim Rowland. Question especially to Leonie. Sorry if I missed it, but how do you most expect to influence what's going on the ground by your work?
So, should I go now or take more questions?
It could actually be a question more broadly for all the speakers. They've given us a lot of information about what they're doing and their analysis of the problem, but the question I think goes for the jugular. The effectiveness of the measures that you've described is the thing that I think is the critical question. What needs to be done?
So I think the aims of our project really are to increase transparency in this area. At the moment we're seeing a lot of commitments, but it's not clear how these are being echoed across sectors. So for us, this is really just a first step. It's identifying a baseline of where we are now to say, this is where we're seeing action and this is what we need in those places. We want to work with the companies and the investors who've made commitments to understand what their barriers to implementing their policies might be, but also to shine a light on the areas which have been less under scrutiny. So whilst we're seeing progress in the areas that I mentioned, there has been much less in areas such as China or the companies involved in the beef trade in Russia. And I think it's about highlighting those areas and highlighting that without similar progress there, we're not going to achieve the gains that we want to see in addressing deforestation. So for us, it really is a first step. And I think we, throughout the next 5 years, while we redo these assessments, we want to increasingly understand the specific context of each of those regions and markets where there has been less progress, to understand whether the approaches that have been taken and the progress that we've seen, whether we need different approaches in those countries or whether we need to do more research before we can engage with those companies, because I think it's likely that the policies that have been put in place and the ways in which they've been implemented, we can't just obviously take that same approach and expect it to work elsewhere. So it really is a first step.
You say highlighting, is that to the media or to governments or to large investors?
To investors and companies. So a lot of companies acting in Europe will be sourcing from some of the companies that we've identified in China, for example. So highlighting to them where there has been a lack of progress and where to fulfill their commitments. They're also going to need to support their suppliers, but also to other NGOs working with other partners to highlight where more research is needed. So it's sort of a variety.
Very much about information.
Yeah.
Forward. Jozef, do you have any thought? What is needed? What's going to be most effective?
So for my line of work, creating change and what is effective is actually at the core of what I do. All of the analysis, the legal analysis that we do, gets converted into legal training modules. So as much as I build my own knowledge of Ghanaian forest law, I do it together with a legal working group and together with national lawyers in Ghana. Now, how many trees are saved by building such capacity is difficult to say. But what you can say is that definitely people are more capable of protecting the forests that they relate to.
Clotilde?
And I think that for the best implementation possible of the UTR, one of the key things that I can highlight is a better understanding of the due diligence system, meaning that operators need to understand the legislation of the country of harvest and what are the key evidence to demonstrate that the timber is legal. It's part of the game that at least it's not only for them to understand that, but also for the logging companies to understand that now that there is a EU timber regulation, they need to provide information to operators in who place timber in the EU. So it's a burden for different actors, but I can also say that it's going to be a burden for the governments in the country of harvest, who are the people, for example, in charge of issuing some of the evidence who can prove the legality. If we need to prove, for example, that the permit is legal, we can need all the process before, so the call for tender and everything like that is in the hands of the government. So it will require some proactive steps from different people to make a better access to information in terms of evidence related to the legality of timber.
So information seems to be the strong theme across the board. Any other question? There's one there on the... I think I perhaps to make this the final question, because we do need to...
I just wonder why the EU has been more successful in hammering out VAPs with African countries than South American or Latin American countries. To the best of my knowledge, there are only 2 agreements, one with Honduras and the other one with Guyana. What explained that? Because on the Latin American side, countries are more developed, so I imagine that they are much better off in controlling the exports, so such agreements could be concluded much more easily.
I do not know all the reasons for this, but what has happened is that in South and Latin America, what has been perceived as a competing mechanism was more popular. So the RED, or reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, which basically promises payments for not cutting down forests, it has been a more popular mechanism, and countries have engaged more with this mechanism than they have with the VPA mechanism. I think this is only partially true. They are not really competing, because in the end they will boil down to the same critical aspects. I think another reason may be simply bilateral ties. If the UK considers this as a priority, the VPA and flag licensing and the UTR, then they will pump money into call for proposals, and they are mainly linked to former colonies. So I think that may be also a part of the explanation.
Yeah. A very quick last question, perhaps.
Basically, this is kind of like a more open general question to everybody. It's like a statement. So you were discussing about the definitions, and you were finding that there's a variety of definitions for legality. What kind of language, not French or English language, but a universal language, so using kind of like quite positive words in order to describe or come up with new definitions for what legal and illegal may be. So using that for some of the quotas as well. I don't know if that's possible as leaders, and it's just like a general question.
One for Jozef.
The language of legality always depends on the laws that are used to determine that particular legality. And so if we are talking about legality according to Ghanaian law, you will come across legal concepts that are actually typically Ghanaian and linked to more of an Anglophone or a common law legal system. Whereas if you go to other countries, this terminology may be more civil law and maybe country specific from time to time. What I do think is a positive aspect of the definition of legality that is used by the VPAs is that it is negotiated. It is not just a bunch of lawyers in a room determining what legal is. It is multiple stakeholders coming together and reaching a consensus on what they think are the key elements of legality. And in addition, kind of creating this wish list of where they think this legality can evolve to something even more positive. I think that is the positive in this definition of legality, which is maybe rather in the structure and the setup than in the language that is used.
It's an interesting question. I'm thinking through all the possibilities there, but I'm afraid I've got to draw this session to a close. I'm extremely grateful for the three contributors, and maybe if you're around at the end, maybe these folks might want to buttonhole you to inquire further about forestry issues. But thanks very much for your combined contribution. Thanks. The final session, if the speakers would like to come forward and occupy these seats. Do you want to take a seat? Is it Peter? Okay. Thanks. Good. I'll just say a few words by way of have you slides?
Yes.
One second there. There's a sort of common theme, I think, which has run throughout the conference, which is about consumption and the way we use resources and the trade aspects of that specifically. And waste is certainly in line with that. I mean, it's been a long-standing problem of environmental law for as long as I've been around, which is a long time. But it somehow transformed itself in recent years. We've looked at waste as an environmental problem, something which generates pollution. That's a traditional reason for regulating waste management. But increasingly, the tendency is to view this as something different. That's, a wasteful use of resources that should in some or other way be reused. So we move on to these ideas of recycling society, circular economy and so on. So it's a subject that I'm particularly fascinated by. Sadly, the time's never enough to get into everything you would do. I'm going to shut up. We've got three expert speakers who I'm sure will be able to give some really good insights into that. The first is Peter Barczak, if I pronounced that correctly, who's Polish, and has done various works as a surveyor, as an environment ministry officer, but most recently working with the European Environmental Bureau. Some of you will know this organisation, which is a grouping of NGOs. So somehow or other we have these 140 national environmental NGOs, and Piotr and his colleagues will pull together from them consistent views as to what is needed. We look forward to your presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor, for a nice introduction. While we wait for the presentation, I thank you very much for remaining in the room. We're going to talk about rubbish. It's amazing that you want to hear about rubbish, but we will show you how complex the rubbish issue may be. I'm Polish, I don't speak English, so however, I have the presentation, so if you don't understand, you may see it here. Maybe some spelling mistakes will occur. Anyway, I don't work on TTIP. I don't know anything about that. It's for you, your homework, to find linkages to that, okay? I'm not even going to attempt that. I'm going to speak about a couple of things. Consumers, products, exactly what is written, packaging and waste. And also how the new hype word of circular economy is actually a way to reconcile the economics and environment through better waste management. Thank you also to everybody for inviting the EB, for the organizers. We are an umbrella organization that already for 40 years we have been consulting, lobbying the Commission and the Parliament, and we are based in Brussels, so you know what does it mean. You can check more details on the website, but not now, please. Just listen to me what I'm going to say. But we work not only with NGOs, we work also with waste management organizations, with industry, with retailers, with producers, to find best ways, I mean, talking on my issue, on waste issues, to find best ways to reduce the problem. The problem is not only end of pipe problem, as Professor said. We have to look more upstream on how the products are designed. That's why we are very much calling for zero waste. Mariel will also explain that. Mariel explained practical examples already, but at the EU level, we see that there is the former Commissioner Janez Potočnik. He also said zero waste is possible, and more politicians are finding this this solution as a viable solution, as the one that works. Although we still have problems in many countries, in Eastern especially. So we also ran this campaign, Make Resources Count, where we want to show waste management has to be improved, but not only by thinking end of pipe, but by thinking upstream, how to decouple the growth, economic growth from environmental degradation and resources use. It has to be an absolute decoupling, which means less resource use. It's not only that we are going to more make resources more efficient. No, we have to reduce them, and I'm going to tell you why. So yes, there is an economic reason behind. We are losing a lot of industry, you know that. A lot of them going to China, to India. Do we have to really hope that they will come back? Well, you can hope, but I don't believe it will happen. But what we can do, we can invest in post-consumer industry. We can have those recycling facilities here, repair, very important facilities, repair activities. We can invest in them. That's why we could. That's where we could make economic benefits. It is about electronic, textiles, wooden furniture, whatever. At the European Union, last year there was a binding document agreed by all the member states, which is 7 environmental action program, where all the member states agreed bindingly to stop landfilling and incineration of recyclable and compostable. So there is not only a will, but there are already binding agreements that have to be followed. All of them, they follow the waste management hierarchy. Well, this is a very complex issue, but I guess maybe for many of you it's the first time you see that. The first most important thing of waste management is to prevent waste. Best waste is no waste. Then the second one is reuse. We have to think about ways that somebody's waste can be somebody's resources. We have to reuse it again before even thinking about recycling. Recycling is only a transformation of material. That is the last step. And the last step, which we don't like, is the disposal. And disposal means landfilling and incineration is equal. That's why European Union came up with two directives, one of them on waste management and one circular economy. They are quite ambitious, but achievable. It means to achieve 70% recycling average overall. I will not go into details of that, but also stopping landfilling of recyclable and compostable waste by 2025. But also important part, they are aiming to boost eco-design as an important tool to actually improve waste management. Whatever we put today on the market will become waste in 5, 10, 15 years. So the time to improve waste management in 15 years is now. Okay, this hype, these buzzwords of circular economy is everything. Everybody thinks of circles, but what those mean? I would like to emphasize that, because this is often forgotten. Those circles should be slow. What does it mean? It means that products should be durable. They should last a long time. They should be repairable also, so that they extend their lifetime even longer. They should be small or thin, or they should be minimum. It means that we need sufficient materials. We don't need anything that is not necessary, single-use items, even if they are perfectly recyclable or compostable. Take plastic bags or any packaging, plastic packaging, or food waste. If it's not necessary, but if it's perfectly recyclable, it doesn't mean we have to produce the extent of that. They should be local. The territorial hierarchy is the key word here, but also circular economy starts at home. We produce waste at home, we have to separate it at home. And waste is also a value. We have to keep it in our communities to use this value. Also, not only materially, physically, but also as a incentive to think about new solutions. And they have to be clean. This is very important. It is quite heavily discussed now in Brussels. For example, PVC industry. PVC is perfectly recyclable, but it consists of different toxins, phthalates, and we have to, even if we want to have high recycling, we should not put back in the loop any toxics again, because we will have a problem for many years to come. So we have to clean the cycles. The design, which is another part that we are working on, as I say again, waste and design of products is very much interlinked. Already 80% of environmental impacts of products are determined at design stage, and this comes from the European Commission. So I believe here in the creativity of retailers or of producers. If they can produce nicely, nice items that they want us to sell, to buy, they also should use this creativity to improve their products, to make them that we want to keep them for a long time, like packaging. I would like to have packaging that I want to keep, like nice boxes, and use them maybe again. But a nice example of this, how design is important. Plastic bags. This is a pure example of badly designed product. We keep it only for a couple of, hours maybe, and then we dispose it. And it takes much time to decompose. So they were fortunately recently tackled by the binding legislation at the EU. You can check everything in the emails.